At 2:42 on the morning of August 2nd, 1943, the humid air of the Blackett Strait felt like a wet shroud draped over the crew of the USS Scrapper. Lieutenant James Miller, known to his men as Greasy because he spent more time in the engine room than on the bridge, wiped a mixture of sweat and salt from his brow. He was 31 years old, a former mechanical engineer from Detroit who had traded a comfortable life designing piston rings for the chaotic, oil-slicked reality of the Solomon Islands. He stood on the deck of a vessel that, by all official naval records, shouldn't have existed in its current form. To the High Command in Pearl Harbor, the Scrapper was a PT boater small, wooden motor torpedo boat designed for hit-and-run attacks. To the Japanese Imperial Navy, it was a one-way coffin, a floating joke made of plywood and optimism. But to Miller and his crew of 11 misfits, the Scrapper was a masterpiece of salvaged defiance. The darkness surrounding them was absolute, broken only by the phosphorescent glow of the wake behind them and the distant, rhythmic drumming of heavy engines. Those engines didn't belong to American ships. They belonged to the Sender-class cruiser and its escort of destroyers, a steel wall of Japanese naval might moving through the slot with the confidence of apex predators. The Japanese admirals on the bridge of the Sendai weren't worried about PT boats. They had spent the last 18 months watching American torpedoes fail to detonate, bounce off hulls, or run deep and harmlessly beneath their keels. They viewed the American Mosquito fleet as a nuisance to be swatted, not a threat to be feared. They didn't know that the boat approaching them tonight didn't carry the standard-issue failures of the American military-industrial complex. Earlier that year, the Scrapper had been nearly written off as junk after a Japanese dive bomber splintered its stern. Instead of sending it to the scrap heap, Miller had towed the carcass into a hidden jungle cove, away from the prying eyes of the shore patrol and the rigid regulations of the Navy Bureau of Ships. For 6 weeks, the crew worked like ghosts in the moonlight. They didn't have a dry dock, so they used palm logs and pulleys. They didn't have spare parts, so they became the most efficient thieves in the South Pacific. Miller had realized a bitter truth. If you play by the rules, you die by the rules. And the rules said a PT boat carried 4 Mark 14 torpedoes. Those torpedoes were supposed to be the great equalizer, but in reality they were expensive paperweights that rarely exploded. Miller made a radical decision that would have seen him court-martialed if he hadn't been in the middle of a war zone. He ordered his men to winch the torpedo tubes off the deck and dump them into the bay. In their place, the Scrapper began to take on a terrifying, Frankenstein-like appearance. From the carcass of a wrecked P-39 Airacabra fighter plane found rotting in a swamp, Miller salvaged a 37mm M4 autocannon. This wasn't a naval gun. It was a weapon designed to punch through tank armor from the air. He bolted it directly to the bow, reinforcing the wooden deck with steel plates stripped from a sunken Japanese barge. 2 cooled the Scrappers, 3 massive Packard engines, which were being pushed far beyond their design specifications. He rigged a secondary cooling loop using copper piping scavenged from a downed Mitsubishi Zero. He bypassed the governors, those mechanical shackles that kept the engines from melting themselves, allowing the Scrapper to reach RPMs that made the entire hull vibrate like a tuning fork. If you want to see how this improvised mechanical beast stood its ground against the pride of the Japanese fleet, please hit that like button and subscribe as we dive deeper into the defiance of the USS Scrapper. The situation in the Solomon Islands in mid-1943 was one of desperate attrition. The Tokyo Express, a nightly run of Japanese destroyers and cruisers, delivering reinforcements to Guadalcanal and beyond, was a constant thorn in the side of the Allied command. The Americans were winning the war of production, but in the narrow, treacherous channels of the Solomons, raw steel often mattered less than who saw whom first. The Japanese had mastered night fighting. Their lookouts were trained to see in the dark, with specialized optics, and their long-lance torpedoes were the most lethal underwater weapons in the world, capable of traveling miles at high speed without leaving a bubble trail. Against this, the PT boat was supposed to be the American answer, cheap, fast, and expendable. But the expendable part was becoming too literal. In the previous months, dozens of PT boats had been lost for almost zero gain. The wooden hulls offered no protection against even light machine gun fire, and the gasoline-filled tanks turned them into floating pyres at the slightest spark. The crews were beginning to feel like bait. This was the environment that pushed Greasy Miller to his breaking point. He watched his friends vanish in orange fireballs, victims of equipment that didn't work and tactics that were outdated. He decided that if the Scrapper was going down, it would go down as a predator, not a target. On the night of August 2nd, the Scrapper sat low in the water, its engines muffled by a custom underwater exhaust system Miller had fashioned from rubber hosing and empty oil drums. This modification reduced the boat's acoustic signature, allowing it to sit just 500 yards off the coast of Kolombangara, without being detected by the Japanese destroyer's hydrophones. Miller's crew was silent. In the bow, gunner's mate Shorty Vance gripped the handles of the 37mm Aerocabra gun. His pockets were heavy with armor-piercing rounds he'd polished by hand. Amidships, the catapult teams stood ready. This was Miller's most insane innovation. Lacking torpedoes, he had built 2 spring-loaded launching racks designed to hurl modified 300-pound depth charges. The idea was simple and suicidal. Get so close to a Japanese ship that you could literally toss an explosive onto its deck. As the clock ticked toward 3 a.m., the silhouette of the Sendai emerged from the mist. It was a massive, intimidating shape, over 500 feet of steel, bristling with 5.5-inch guns. It was moving at a steady 20 knots, flanked by 2 destroyers. On the bridge of the Sendai, Captain Noboru Sato adjusted his binoculars. He saw a small speck on the water, a tiny blip that his radar operators had dismissed as sea clutter or a reef. When he finally realized it was an American PT boat, he didn't call for a battle stations alert. He didn't even order his primary batteries to fire. He simply turned to his executive officer and chuckled. "The Americans are sending us firewood," he remarked in Japanese. He ordered the secondary 25mm anti-aircraft guns to swat the fly. To him, the Scrapper was nothing more than a minor distraction on his way to the landing zones. But the fly didn't behave as expected. Normally, a PT boat would fire its torpedoes from a distance and then turn in a wide, panicked arc to escape under a smokescreen. The Scrapper did neither. Instead of turning, Miller slammed the throttles forward. The 3 Packard engines didn't just roar, they screamed. The boat lurched forward, its bow rising out of the water as it accelerated with a violence that nearly threw the crew overboard. In less than 30 seconds, the Scrapper was hitting 45 knots, then 48, then a terrifying 52 knots. The wooden hull groaned, the scavenged copper pipes hissed with steam, and the vibration was so intense it rattled the fillings in the sailors' teeth. Captain Sato's smile vanished. Through his glass, he saw the tiny wooden boat transforming into a whitewater blur, heading straight for the Sendai's midsection. "Open fire," he screamed, but it was too late for the heavy guns. The Sendai's massive 5.5-inch cannons were designed to fight other cruisers miles away. They couldn't depress low enough to hit a target that was already closing within 200 yards. The 25mm tracers began to stitch the water around the Scrapper, tearing through the plywood railings and shattering the windshield of the cockpit. But Miller didn't flinch. He stayed glued to the wheel, his eyes locked on the towering grey wall of the cruiser's hull. He wasn't just charging, he was aiming for the blind spot. Every large warship has a zone close to its hull where its primary and secondary weapons simply cannot reach. By closing the distance at a suicidal speed, Miller was entering a sanctuary of steel. The Japanese sailors on the Sendai's deck looked down in a mix of horror and disbelief. They could see the individual rivets on the Scrapper's scavenged armor plates. They could see Miller's grease-stained face. And then they saw the bowgun. Shorty Vance didn't wait for an order. He opened fire with the 37mm Arakabra gun at point-blank range. The sound was a rhythmic thud, dash, thud, dash, thud, that drowned out the wind. The armor-piercing shells, designed to kill tanks, punched through the Sendai's thin, unarmored skin near the waterline like a hot needle through wax. But Miller wasn't interested in sinking the ship with a popgun. He was looking for the hangar deck-there area, where the Japanese stored their reconnaissance float planes and, more importantly, the volatile aviation fuel used to power them. As the Scrapper pulled alongside the Sendai, so close that the PT boat's mast nearly scraped the cruiser's hull, Miller yelled the command they had practiced for weeks in the jungle: launch, launch, launch. The spring-loaded catapults hissed, and two massive depth charges, their fuses shortened to a terrifying 3-second delay, soared through the air. They didn't hit the water. They sailed through the open hangar doors of the Sendai, disappearing into the dark, crowded belly of the flagship. For a heartbeat, there was a sickening silence. And then the night exploded. A pillar of white and orange flame erupted from the center of the Sendai, a geyser of fire that rose 100 feet into the air. The one-way coffin had just delivered a lethal blow to the heart of the Imperial Navy's local command, and the Battle of Blackett Strait had only just begun. The Japanese admirals were no longer laughing. They were screaming into radios as their flagship began to tear itself apart from the inside out, and the small wooden boat that had done the impossible was already disappearing back into the smoke, a ghost born from the scrap heap of history. By 3:07 a.m., the Blackett Strait had transformed from a silent corridor of shadows into a chaotic furnace. The explosion inside the Sendai's hangar deck had been more effective than James Greasy Miller could have ever dreamed. The aviation fuel, stored in thin-walled canisters for the cruiser's reconnaissance planes, had ignited in a massive fireball that was now gutting the ship's midsection. White-hot tongues of flame licked at the bridge, and the screams of Japanese sailors could be heard even over the roar of the Scrapper's engines. But for Miller and his crew, the triumph lasted only seconds. The Sendai was crippled, but she wasn't dead, and more importantly, her guardians were coming. The two escorting destroyers, the Amagiri and the Yajiri, had recovered from their initial shock. To the Japanese commanders, the sight of a lone wooden boat inflicting such catastrophic damage was not just a tactical failure. It was a personal insult. They didn't see the Scrapper as a vessel of war. They saw it as a ghost, a yukai made of plywood and spite. As the Sendai slowed, listing 5 degrees to port, the Amagiri swung her bow toward the Scrapper's wake. The destroyer was a 3,000-ton Predator, capable of 35 knots, armed with 5-inch guns that could vaporize a PT boat with a single near-miss. On the Scrapper, the adrenaline of the attack was being replaced by the cold reality of mechanical overreach. Miller felt it before he heard it. The deck beneath his boots began to shudder with a jagged, uneven rhythm. The center Packard engine, the heart of the boat's power, let out a metallic shriek that sounded like a saw blade hitting a stone. Thick, acrid blue smoke began to pour from the engine room hatch. The scavenged copper pipes from the Mitsubishi Zero, the very modification that had allowed them to reach 50 knots, were failing. The soda, never meant to withstand the sustained, blistering heat of a high-speed escape, was melting. High-pressure coolant began to spray across the red-hot engine blocks, turning the engine room into a pressurized steam cooker. "Greasy, the center block is seizing," yelled Pipes Rafferty, the 20-year-old machinist's mate who had helped Miller build the cooling loop. Rafferty's face was already blistered from the steam. He was holding a grease-stained rag over his mouth, his eyes wide with the knowledge that, if that engine blew, they were sitting ducks. Miller didn't hesitate. He handed the wheel to his second-in-command and dove into the engine room. The heat hit him like a physical blow, a solid wall of 140-degree air saturated with the smell of vaporized glycol and burnt oil. This was the moment Miller had feared. In his quest to outrun the Japanese, he had pushed his Frankenstein creation past the breaking point of physics. Every bolt in the hull felt like it was trying to back out of its hole. He saw the leaker jagged split in a salvaged manifold. Without thinking of the pain, he grabbed a heavy leather welding glove and jammed his hand against the scalding metal, trying to redirect the spray. Internal monologue raced through his mind, a frantic tally of risks and regrets. He thought of Billy Sparks, Henderson, a radio op they'd lost 3 months ago because a standard-issue torpedo had dived straight into the mud instead of hitting a barge. He thought of the letters he'd had to write to mothers in Ohio and Pennsylvania, explaining why their sons weren't coming home. He had promised himself he wouldn't write another one because of faulty equipment. That was why he'd stolen the 37mm gun. That was why he'd built the catapults. He wasn't just fighting the Japanese. He was fighting a bureaucracy that sent boys to war in wooden toys. If his modifications failed now, he wasn't just a failed engineer. He was the man who had led 10 more boys to their deaths. Above deck, the situation was deteriorating. The Amagerie was now less than 800 yards away, her searchlights cutting through the smoke of the burning Sendai. The first 5-inch shell whistled overhead, a sound like a freight train passing at 100 miles per hour, before exploding in a towering geyser of water 50 yards to their starboard. The concussion nearly flipped the Scrapper. Shrapnel rained down on the wooden deck, peppering the hull. Shorty Vance, still strapped into the 37mm Aerocabra mount at the bow, screamed as a piece of hot steel sliced through his shoulder. But he didn't leave his post. He began firing back, the thud-thud-thud of the aircraft gun, a defiant but tiny sound against the thunder of the destroyer's batteries. On the bridge of the Amagerie, Captain Katsumori Yamashiro was possessed by a cold, calculating rage. He didn't understand how the American boat was still moving. He had seen his shells bracket the target 3 times. In the Japanese Naval Academy, they were taught that American crews were soft, reliant on their industrial might and superior numbers. But this boat was different. It didn't move like a Navy vessel. It moved like a cornered animal, erratic and vicious. Yamashiro ordered his helmsman to cease firing the main guns. The spray and the smoke were making the rangefinders unreliable. "We will ram them," he commanded. "Break their spine and leave them for the sharks." The Amagerie surged forward, her sharp, steel bow cutting the waves at 34 knots. She was aiming directly for the Scrapper's stern. To the Japanese sailors lining the rails with submachine guns, it looked like the end of the play. The American boat was visibly slowing, its wake flattening out as the engines choked on their own internal fires. Inside the engine room, Miller was screaming through the pain. The skin on his palm was fusing to the leather glove, but he had managed to bypass the fractured manifold using a length of reinforced rubber hose and 2 hose clamps. He'd been carrying in his pocket since Guadalcanal. "Hit it, Rafferty." Now he roared. Rafferty slammed the starters. The center Packard coughed, spat a cloud of black soot, and then caught. The roar returned, deeper and angrier than before. Miller scrambled back to the cockpit, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He grabbed the wheel just as the Amagerie's searchlights centered on them, turning the world a blinding, artificial white. The destroyer was less than 200 yards away, wall of steel looming over them like a mountain. Miller could see the Japanese officers on the bridge. He could see the rising sun flag snapping in the wind. Most commanders would have tried to turn away, but Miller knew the physics. A turn would expose their broadside, making them an even easier target for the ramming prow. Instead, he did the unthinkable. He didn't turn away from the destroyer. He turned toward it. He steered the Scrapper into a hard banking turn that put them on a collision course with the Amagiri's port side. "What are you doing?" the navigator screamed, clinging to the rail. "The Sendai," Miller yelled back, pointing to the burning cruiser. The Sendai was dying, but she was dying spectacularly. The fire had finally reached the secondary magazine for the 25mm AA guns. Small-bore ammunition was cooking off in thousands of tiny pops, creating a localized fog of cordite and tracers. Miller wasn't trying to outrun the destroyer in the open water. He was heading back into the heart of the Sendai's death throes. As the Amagiri attempted to adjust its course to follow the Scrapper's radical maneuver, the destroyer's massive weight worked against it. It couldn't pivot as fast as the 80-foot wooden boat. Miller pushed the throttles to the far wall, ignoring the screaming protest of the overheated engines. The Scrapper skipped across the Amagiri's bow with mere feet, too. Spare so close that the spray from the destroyer's wake drenched the American sailors. Miller steered the Scrapper directly into the thickest part of the smoke cloud surrounding the Sendai. For a moment, they were blind. The world was nothing but grey soot and the orange glow of the fire. The heat was so intense it bubbled the paint on the Scrapper's hull. But in that blindness, Miller found his advantage. The Japanese destroyers, terrified of colliding with their own burning flagship or each other in the dark, were forced to slow down. Their radar primitive and prone to interference from the massive, burning hunk of metal that was the sender lost the Scrapper entirely. But Miller wasn't done. He knew they couldn't stay in the smoke forever, and he knew the destroyers would be waiting for them to emerge on the other side. He looked at his remaining catapult charge. 1 300-pound depth charge left. He looked at Shorty Vance, who was pale but still gripping the 37mm gun. "We're not leaving yet," Miller said, his voice a low growl. "They think we're trying to hide. They think we're afraid." He checked the compass. The Sendai was drifting south, pushed by the current. The two destroyers were circling to the north, trying to find a clear line of sight. Miller realized that the Japanese had made a fatal assumption. They assumed the one-way coffin was a single-shot weapon that was now empty. They didn't know about the scrap heap ingenuity that had turned a PT boat into a pocket battleship. The turning point came at 3:19 a.m. As the Scrapper drifted at the edge of the smoke, Miller saw the Yagiri, the second destroyer, moving slowly. Its crew focused entirely on the burning Sendai, looking for survivors. The Yagiri was vulnerable, her side exposed, her guns pointed away. "Rafferty, give me every ounce of pressure you've got," Miller whispered. He didn't use the engines at first. He let the Scrapper drift silently out of the smoke, a darkened shape against the black water. He waited until they were within 300 yards. The Japanese lookouts were so distracted by the inferno of the flagship that they didn't see the shadow approaching from the mist. "Now," Miller said. The engines roared to life. But this time, it wasn't a charge to escape. It was a charge to finish the job. If you want to see how this final, desperate gambit changed the course of the engagement and left the Japanese Admiralty in a state of permanent shock, stay with us as we head into the final climax of this impossible night. This wasn't just a battle for survival anymore. It was a message written in fire and scavenged steel. At 3:22 on the morning of August 2nd, 1943, the USS Scrapper became more than just a boat. It became a legend born of friction and fire. As the shadow of the wooden vessel cleared the oily smoke of the dying Sendai, Lieutenant James Greasy Miller stood at the wheel. his hands raw and bleeding from the heat of the engine room. He could see the Yajiri just Ibai-Wushi yards away. The Japanese destroyer was a sleek, lethal silhouette, but its crew was looking the wrong way. Their searchlights desperately scanning the distant horizon for a phantom fleet they believed was responsible for the destruction of their flagship. They never expected the threat to come from the heart of the furnace they were already mourning. "Shorty, give 'em everything," Miller roared. Despite the shrapnel wound in his shoulder, Shorty Vance kicked the firing pedal of the 37mm Iracabra gun. The bow of the Scrapper bucked with every round. The armor-piercing shells, designed to punch through the thick steel of Tiger tanks, shredded the Yajiri's unarmored upper works. Sailors on the destroyer's deck were cut down before they could even reach their battle stations. The sound was a rhythmic, mechanical hammer, the sound of American industry repurposed for jungle vengeance. Then came the final move. Miller steered the Scrapper into a sharp, banking turn, bringing the port side flush with the Yajiri's aft quarter. The Japanese destroyer's captain finally realized what was happening, and ordered his engines to full astern, trying to open the distance, but the Scrapper was too fast, too close. "Launch," Miller screamed. The final spring-loaded catapult hissed with the force of 1,000 pounds of tension. The 300-pound depth charge, modified with a contact fuse, scavenged from a dud Japanese bomb, arced through the air like a heavy, black teardrop. It struck the Yagiri just above the waterline, right where the ship's own depth charges were racked for anti-submarine warfare. The resulting secondary explosion was so violent it lifted the Scrapper's stern out of the water. A wall of white water and steel fragments erupted from the Yagiri's side, the blast wave shattering every window in the Scrapper's cockpit and knocking Miller unconscious for several long, terrifying seconds. When he opened his eyes, the world was silent. His ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the ocean. He looked back to see the Yagiri listing heavily, its stern engulfed in a blue-white electrical fire as its depth charge racks continued to cook off in a chain reaction of total destruction. But the price of the kill was immediate. The Scrapper's engines, pushed to 120% of their rated capacity for nearly an hour, finally surrendered. The center-packet engine suffered a catastrophic rod failure, the piston punching through the block with a sound like a gunshot. The two outboard engines groaned and seized as the last of the coolant evaporated into the humid night air. The Scrapper didn't stop. It glided to a halt, dead in the water, just as the second destroyer, the Amagiri, began to turn its searchlights toward the source of the blast. In the sudden silence, Miller heard the frantic splashing of Japanese survivors and the distant rhythmic thumping of the Amagiri's 5-inch guns beginning to range in. They were sitting ducks, a wooden target in a sea of steel. "Rafferty, can we get a spark?" Miller croaked, his voice raw from the smoke. Down in the engine room, Rafferty was working in knee-deep water mixed with oil and blood. "The blocks are fused, Skipper. There's nothing left to turn." Miller looked at his men. They were battered, burned, and bleeding, but they were alive. They had done what no one in the Pentagon thought possible. They had engaged a heavy cruiser and 2 destroyers with a boat held together by scavenged bolts and sheer defiance. They had won, but now they were going to die. Miller reached for his .45 caliber sidearm, preparing for the final boarding action, when a strange thing happened. The Amagiri, instead of closing in to finish them, suddenly veered away. In the confusion of the smoke and the multiple explosions, the Japanese captain had become convinced that he was being hunted by a massive American task force. He saw the Sendai sinking and the Yajiri crippled, and his radar screens were flooded with interference from the burning wrecks. Fearing he would be the next victim of this invisible fleet, he signaled a general retreat and fled into the darkness of the slot at 35 knots, leaving the Scrapper alone with the ghosts of the Imperial Navy. At 7:45 a.m., APBY Catalina flying boats spotted a small, blackened hull drifting near the coast of Kolombangara. When the rescue crew arrived, they found 12 men sitting on a deck that was scorched white, surrounded by empty 37mm casings and the smell of scorched copper. The USS Scrapper was towed back to the base at Tulogi, but the reception was not what the crew expected. The following morning, a rear admiral and 2 captains from the Bureau of Ships arrived at the dock. They didn't come with medals. They came with clipboards and scowls. They looked at the 37mm Arukabra gun bolted to the bow. They looked at the illegal catapult racks and the bypassed engine governors. They looked at James Miller and told him he was lucky he wasn't being court-martialed for the unauthorized destruction of government property and gross violation of naval engineering regulations. To the bureaucracy, the Scrapper wasn't a hero. It was a liability, an embarrassment to the designers who had told the Navy that their standard equipment was sufficient. Miller was stripped of his command 3 weeks later and reassigned to a dry dock facility in Pearl Harbor, where he spent the rest of the war repairing standard-issue engines. The Scrapper itself was deemed beyond economical repair. In October 1943, without ceremony or honor, the boat was stripped of its scavenged parts and burned on a beach to prevent its non-standard modifications from being copied by other crews who might be tempted to ignore regulations. The official reports of the Battle of Blackett Strait credited the sinking of the Sendai to unspecified night surface action and the damage to the Yagiri to a suspected submarine attack. The name USS Scrapper appeared nowhere in the official commendations. The 1,200 Japanese casualties that night were a victory recorded by history. But the men who caused it were told to keep their mouths shut. For decades, the story of the Scrapper existed only in the fading memories of its crew and the whispered legends of PT boat sailors in the South Pacific. It wasn't until the late 1990s, when Japanese naval records were fully cross-referenced with local American logs by a persistent naval historian, that the truth began to emerge. The Japanese survivors hadn't reported a submarine or a fleet of destroyers. They had reported a single demon boat that moved at impossible speeds and fired shells that felt like they came from the sky. James Miller passed away in 1982 in a small house outside Detroit. He died a retired mechanic, a man who could fix anything but the broken system he had once served. He never talked about the war, except for one thing. He kept a small, twisted piece of copper piping on his workbench. His grandchildren thought it was just scrap. They didn't know it was a piece of a Mitsubishi Zero, the very piece that had allowed a wooden boat to defy an empire. Today, if you visit the Solomon Islands, the jungle has reclaimed the secret coves where the Scrapper was born. The salt water has long since dissolved the steel plates Miller bolted to the deck. But the lesson of the Scrapper remains. It is a reminder that, in the face of impossible odds, the most dangerous weapon is not the one designed in a boardroom or stamped out in a factory. It is the weapon forged in the mind of a man who refuses to accept that his equipment isn't good enough. It is the triumph of American desperation over imperial confidence. History is written by the victors, but the truth is kept alive by the grease-stained hands of the men who were there. Innovation doesn't always come from the top down. It bubbles up from the engine rooms and the foxholes, from the people who see a problem and refuse to wait for permission to fix it. That's how wars are won. Not with perfect machines, but with imperfect men who have the courage to rebuild the world with whatever scrap they can find. If the story of Greasy Miller and the USS Scrapper moved you, if it reminded you that one person with a wrench and a dream can change the course of history, then hit that like button. Every single like tells the world that these stories matter, that the names of men like Miller, Vance, and Rafferty shouldn't be forgotten. Subscribe to the channel to join us as we uncover more lost chapters of military history. And please, drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and what you think of the Scrapper's illegal modifications. You aren't just a viewer, you are the guardian of these memories. We'll see you in the next one, where we continue to explore the incredible things that happen when the rules are broken for all the right reasons.